it's I think it's a more sophisticated to look at the human experience, not to have that mind-body duality, but look at it as one unified element.
Welcome to the ReeThink podcast. Today I have another guest, Skip Rizzo, with me. He is a pioneer in the intersection of clinical psychology, neuroscience, in immersive technology. And yes, welcome Skip. Introduce yourself to the audience. I'm super stoked about this meeting.
Well, I've been looking forward to this myself for a while since we first talked in podcast, and I'm thankful that you offered me a spot. So with that, my name is Skip Rizzo, and I'm the director of the clinical, or medical now, VR laboratory at the University of Southern California Institute for Creative Technologies. But I also do a lot of work outside in private industry, and I'm gradually transitioning more to doing a lot of that. I've spent the last 30 years in academia, designing, developing, and evaluating VR simulations for mental health, rehabilitation, medical purposes. And while I'll continue to do that, I'm looking forward to trying to move more towards something we'll talk about, productization, rather than just academic advancement. But anyway, that's what I do. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I guess that's it. That's me.
But you have such a interesting career. So how did that happen that you end up like doing this kind of work, in particular with VR experiences and clinical psychology?
You know, sometimes careers evolve in a way that, there's no plan. There's kind of a plan, but there's an old saying: if you want to make God laugh, tell her your plans. And that's really what happened here. It was just a matter of circumstances that fell into place. Basically, my work in clinical psychology led me to, when I completed my doctorate and my internship, I worked in a brain injury rehabilitation center, and I really liked working with that population. But back in the late 80s, early 90s, there wasn't really much computer technology that could be applied to the process of brain rehabilitation or game-based activities. And I was really frustrated. And it turned out there was this one event that occurred, and I started thinking more about game technology for rehab, and I had the access to SimCity on a Nintendo system from, I think, 91 or 2. And my clients liked it, and SimCity is really a very powerful executive function training activity, even though it's in a game format. I really I got engaged in that fashion, but realized that SimCity wasn't going to be the tool for the wide, diverse population of people that have brain injuries, some of which could never learn to use the control, the hand controls of the old 1990s controllers. So then when I learned about what virtual reality was, a more natural way to interact with simulations or computer data, computers generally, more intuitive and natural way to interact with this stuff, then it struck me that we could use VR to deliver that kind of rehabilitation activity, game-based, engaging, adjustable, all those things. And that's when I left my clinical work and took a position at USC and started the lab in 1995. And that was the inspiration.
Okay, that's amazing. I mean, how did you figure that, for instance, because I love SimCity, unfortunately they didn't make a new version, I think 10 years ago or something. But what was it that you realized that it is great for executive function?
You know, um, I think it was actually right. It was before the SimCity experience.
Mm-hmm.
I had a client who came running into my office, a patient, and he goes, Skip, I got to show you something. This was a 22-year-old male, frontal lobe injury from a car accident.
Mm-hmm.
Really nice kid, but hard to motivate to keep him to stay on task for different types of rehab training activities and so on. And he comes in and he's waving this thing around. I go, what is it? And he goes, it's called a Game Boy. And it's like, whoa, what is it? What does it do? And it's, 1990 or whatever, before they had come out. And so he starts playing Tetris on it, sitting there in my office. And I was transfixed. He was glued to it. I was watching him for 15, 20 minutes, glued to this activity. And actually, he was pretty good at it. So it not only showed me that, maybe this kind of interactive training could make a difference in someone's skill development and hopefully brain function, but that it was motivating. He was engaged, and that was a level of engagement that traditional rehab activities very rarely reached in getting that level of focus. And so at that point, that was really the tipping point where I started looking into the game stuff, SimCity, other games as well along the way, until I came upon the VR thing. The key thing with VR was that I had heard Sharon Lanier do a national public radio presentation on VR, and he was describing in a department store, the customers could go in and put on his VPL headset. This was like 92 or 3, and interact to build a kitchen, so they could look around and pick where the stove went, where the refrigerator changed the color, change your mind, mix it up, move it around, and then order it, and it would be all built like that. And so when I heard that, I thought, wow, that's real. That's like building real world environments. And so that's part of a rehab process, is not only the drill and practice for improving mental ability, kind of like, brain training games or like SimCity and so on, but to do it in a functionally relevant environment so that you maximize the transfer of training or generalization to the real world. I mean, all rehab has to have, you have to be able to point to what it's going to fix in the real world. Otherwise, you're just giving somebody a fun time, and that's okay too.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that was that. It was like, that brought it all together. And so it was, if it hadn't been for those events, I might not be here getting to talk to you. At the day after I heard the Sharon Lanier thing, I went running into work. I went to my boss and I go, hey, I think there's something to this VR thing. And she goes, well, that's interesting. I just got this flyer in the mail, pre-email, and it on the top of the flyer, it says Virtual Reality and Persons with Disabilities Conference. And she goes, there's this conference going on. If you want, we have funding. We can send you to it. And it's like, I'm all in. So there was just all great luck,
Are you familiar with the work of Stephen Kotler about flow?
So, yes.
Because one thing that just came to me is the way you described watching this boy engaged with this Game Boy, that it's triggered something in the brain, and flow is particular potent in order to create brain plasticity. I always say it wrong in English. Plasticity. So plastic.
Neuroplasticity.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I was thinking, is that the thing that triggers it? Because on the other hand, I also understood like transfer is created whenever, on the one hand, the thing that you're trying to learn is, let's say, you are deeply engaged with it, and it's also triggering certain things that you already know in that sense. So it triggers the things that you are already understands, and bridge it in a way to the new things you're learning in a really engaging and deep way.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think, we have this process called associative learning that has to do with tying a new bit of knowledge with something you already have. And I think, VR offers that kind of opportunity. The whole flow thing, I think, is fundamental
Mm-hmm.
to understanding what we're trying to do in VR. We're not just trying to exactly mimic the training or the testing or the treatment tools of the real world. We're
Mm-hmm.
trying to do it with a little bit of verve or a little bit of engagement to be able
Yeah.
to do it in a way that keeps people going. And when you look at, if you look at what they, in the gaming industry, people refer to the flow channel. And
Mm-hmm.
that's where any task, you want to make it challenging enough, but not
Mm-hmm.
too hard, so that
Mm-hmm.
people don't feel brutalized by the game,
Yeah.
that they can do well. But you don't want to make it too easy either, because
Mm-hmm.
otherwise it's going to become boring. So you want to keep the task demands in that channel so that people feel the competition and I think that's just something that was learned in the gaming industry, over years.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's learning that reflects what's going on in the brain. If you want to
Mm-hmm.
keep somebody engaged in a task that they can learn or grow from, you've got to make it challenging enough to be interesting, but not too hard, not too easy to be boring. So
Mm-hmm.
I think I think that's at the core of this whole rehab perspective. I mean, that's the thing that we're selling. When you think about, say, physical therapy, physical rehabilitation, something we can see the action, very clear, objective measurements, and so on that. Well,
Mm-hmm.
we're not proposing with virtual rehabilitation to do some new process. We're really trying to make the same thing that traditional rehab does, but we're trying to do it in a systematic and engaging way, in a
Mm-hmm.
way that makes it so that a patient doesn't get bored with it. I mean, let's face it, people after they have a stroke or a brain injury, it's
Yeah.
very frustrating for them to do rehabilitation because they're not only it's not only hard to do the action,
Mm-hmm.
but they're reminded every step of the way of what they lost. And so that's a hard thing. And anything that can help a person to do it better or to become more engaged in it is going to be a net positive, I think, in the types of clinical outcomes.
Oh, okay. That's it makes a lot of sense. Um, and therefore I can see how this technology can help, like engaging the people in a way that it helps to alleviate their symptoms over time in that process.
Yeah, there's an old saying, what's learned with pleasure is learned full measure. And that I think that feeds into the neuroplasticity element as well, that, if you're getting a bunch of dopamine released. I mean, there's a neuroscientist that I really admire, Mike Merzenich. He's from San Francisco, and he's been doing neuroscience for a number of years. He has a brain um, training program, a company that focuses on that. But he says that attention, novelty, and reward
Mm-hmm.
drive three different neurotransmitter systems that
Yeah.
underlie neuroplasticity.
Mm-hmm.
And attention, novelty, and reward, those are all elements of good games
Yes.
and good
Yes.
VR rehab.
Yes. And that's the feedback loop, right? It's also like working in that regard, and it's so interesting because, as I mentioned in the work of Stephen Kotler, this is also, he calls it basically flow triggers, and it's the combination with, as you mentioned, also the skill to challenge ratio, that there is like this Goldilocks zone. He calls it like, he says like it needs to be maybe 5% more challenging than what you actually are in the skill level terms. And then in the combination with novelty, which creates attention as well. Also, in order to have flow, you need I think at least 20 minutes uninterrupted focus in order that everything kicks in. Yeah.
I agree with that. And that is a key thing, is that extended concentration. And, if you look at a lot of clinical conditions, part of the symptom picture, and this is a very general statement, is that inability to maintain attention for long periods of time, that always being distractible, like what you see with ADHD, or you see with hyper distractibility or hyper attentiveness that you might see in an autism, a person with autism. And it goes across a lot of areas of clinical space. If you can get someone to maintain their focus in a structured clinical way. I mean, there's therapeutic engagement and there's just plain old engagement. And that's what we try to do in the creation of these VR activities, is to foster therapeutic engagement, whether it's to help you recover brain function or to challenge a previous emotional response, a fear response, or to even confront and reprocess difficult emotional memories, as in the case of PTSD. We're trying to foster, a focused therapeutic engagement that can make a difference for folks.
And I mean, you mentioned it already. You worked across PTSD, ADHD, autism, traumatic brain injuries, and Alzheimer's. And among all these domains, what surprised you the most?
Well, I think, God, there's a lot of surprises in this field. First off, my biggest surprise is that, VR healthcare hasn't just taken over the world yet. But I think, you always get a sense of delight and surprise the first time you put somebody in a VR headset for an activity, because, they don't know what to expect. They think they imagine it, but then you put a headset on them and all of a sudden their jaw drops. It's like, oh, wow. I mean, but I've also had clients and people I've done demos for that, you put the headset on them and they think they're watching TV. They just sit there and you almost got to kind of manually move their head so that they get the sense of tracking and immersion and interactivity and all that. And then that's when you get the effect. So that is always, I mean, it's kind of universal. I was just at a conference and we were talking about this, that universal impact that VR has. Now, what surprised me the most, I think, is the clarity in which we can, on one side, the clarity in which we can measure performance in VR environments that I think add value over traditional methods of assessment. And I can talk about that later if you want. I'm thinking about the work we've done with the virtual classroom and other types of assessment modalities. And then on the other side, on the treatment side, the level of emotional engagement that you can get, even if the simulation isn't all that real, or it isn't an exact replica of a real world context, that people get emotionally invested. There's a lot of strategies you can use to enhance that emotional investment, but in straight up therapy, let's face it, that's what we're in the business of as clinicians, is to activate an emotion and work with a patient or a client to help them learn different ways to deal with it, to interpret it, to cope with it, to overcome it. whatever the mode of therapy or the theoretical perspective you might want to take, activating emotions is at the core of a lot of clinical work, and mental health clinical work, and I think VR has a surprising capability to do that,
Mm-hmm.
even if it isn't perfectly, perfect visually. You can do a lot of things that make it so it's very engaging, even if the graphics are a little bit impoverished or the sound may be but that's one of your secret weapons. You can use sound to make up for what visuals might not be able to do.
Mm.
But I think so. Just to summarize, 'cause I know I ramble a lot here, but I'm always amazed and happy to see
Mm-hmm.
that we can measure activity and measure performance in simulations really well, and that we can also activate emotions in a positive therapeutic way, in a
Mm-hmm.
way that's useful for a therapeutic process. Those are the two core processes that go from ADHD to perhaps PTSD or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I totally understand where you're coming from when you describe the experience, like having a virtual headset on, because I remember the first time I used it. I was not impressed by the graphics at all, but I remember it very vividly because it was a experience that I was like under the water and a whale were coming like behind of me, and it was it's hard to describe, but it was something, this mixture of the depth of field, that's one thing, in particular with the sound that is moving in a sense, and of course that you can like move your head, that created something that this experience felt different and really real, although you could clearly tell from the visual perspective that this is not real. The graphics were way not perfect, but nevertheless, the experience I had in that moment was that it was a real experience. I'm underwater and I see this huge blue whale.
That's great. You know, that reminded me of some of the early experiences with some of my colleagues
Mm-hmm.
working in phobias. Rothbaum had worked with fear of heights back,
Yeah.
this is 1993, 94.
Wow.
And if you saw the graphics from the environment she used, very primitive. I mean, it was an Indiana Jones type plank bridge over a gorge. Graphically, it was very cartoonish. And people initially were saying, "Oh, it's not real enough to be effective as a
Mm-hmm.
clinical tool." Well, it turns out that that was one of the first things we learned about with clinical VR, was that you could fool the brain, even if it wasn't, um, exactly a replica of an Indiana Jones bridge. You could put somebody in there, and even though they knew it was a simulation, their frontal lobes were,
Mm-hmm.
telling them, "Oh, this isn't real," whatever. But all of a sudden, what you were saying, the depth cues and maybe the sound of the wind blowing
Mm-hmm.
by or whatever, all of a sudden the limbic systems lighten up and they're getting that kind of a therapeutic fear engagement response. And all of a sudden, you're realizing that it doesn't have to be an exact replica to get that effect. And, maybe you wouldn't sell a game in VR that had that level of realism going across that bridge. But we're not talking about selling games. We're talking
Mm-hmm.
about what are clinical tools that you know, can provide a therapeutic exposure for some element of what the patient needs.
That's great. Mention about VR experiences. You have created a experience specifically for PTSD with the name BraveMind. Maybe you can walk us through what BraveMind does and how it works.
BraveMind is um, a, a virtual reality exposure therapy system. And basically what it does is it takes the principles of what's called trauma-focused therapy for PTSD, the idea that you're not giving somebody medication to forget. You're not trying to teach them how to put that out of their mind. The idea here is that you're helping a patient to confront and reprocess the difficult emotional memories that they faced in a previous traumatic event. And it's, admittedly, it's hard medicine for a hard problem. It's not an easy therapy. And consequently, there was recently a study that came out of meta-analysis, and it's something we've already known, that while it is one of the more effective treatments, if people complete the treatment, it's also one of the more highly dropped out treatments, that people, anywhere from 30 to 40%. Although recent data is showing VR may be may outperform that in terms of reducing dropout. In traditional delivery of that type of exposure therapy, the patient closes their eyes and they are told to imagine their trauma experience and narrate it and tell the story of it. And they do that repeatedly. That's quite hard because, patients, you're asking a patient first off to do the one thing that they absolutely avoid doing, and they've avoided for months, years, and decades sometimes, and that is to think about the trauma. Anytime they think about the trauma, they have a negative response, and they want to avoid thinking about it or going to places that remind them of the trauma. So it has a generalized impact on their everyday functioning and life experience. And so what you try to do is to get them to gradually imagine it. Well, again, it's something that you're trying to get somebody to do exactly the opposite of what they're used to doing. And the motivation to do it is you have to really sell the idea that this is going to be beneficial. Whereas in VR, we do the exact same process. We follow the same clinical protocol for prolonged exposure. There are other ways to use VR for other treatment strategies for PTSD, but we started mimicking the exact protocol, except we use VR. And I think one of the advantages of VR is that you don't have to throw somebody in the deep end of the pool to help them confront their trauma, which oftentimes happens if you ask somebody to imagine their trauma and they've tried avoiding it, but then they try doing it. All of a sudden, they're thinking of the worst possible thing and at risk for a panic attack. And that's something that clinicians try to manage. Sometimes imagination isn't as controllable as you would like to think. So what VR allows is you put somebody in an environment and it captures their attention. And it's not just like what they were traumatized by. It might be, say in the case of a war veteran from Iraq, maybe their trauma memory happened driving a Humvee down a desert road, and the vehicle blew up, and people died, and all the bad things. Well, maybe you take them back where they're in that Humvee, but it's a nice sunny day. It's, they're with their friends, and get them to start talking about the friends, maybe friends that had died at a later point. But you have the capacity to start somebody off at a pace they can handle. And I think that's really important. And it might be one of the keys to making it more adoptable by patients that are resistant, that they realize they can put a toe in the water and they can gradually approach their high level trauma. And, even in those low provocative environments, what you see is you see people talking about events that they haven't talked to anyone about, even non-traumatic events. I mean, everything gets wrapped in a ball of trauma, and they don't talk to their wife, their kids, their parents about their experiences. They don't want to burden them.
Yeah.
And just by that process of beginning to talk about it, that starts to open something up. And this is what we talk about when we say confront and reprocess
Mm-hmm.
difficult emotional memory. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, you go in and you do the exposure, but you talk about it and process it and think about it differently with a clinician that's well trained in how to do this. And
Mm-hmm.
that's an important thing. It's different than just talking to a family member.
Yeah.
Talking to a clinician, they're going to challenge you a little bit or ask for more detail and get at it a little bit more in a therapeutic way. And so I think
Mm-hmm.
that's where the VR engagement, very similar to engaging someone in a rehab task in a game to help recover brain function. This is engaging them in an emotional experience at a pace they can handle to help them understand that emotional experience in a different light and not be so hurt by it. And that happens with repeated practice and exposure. And so if people can stick with it through the initial period and the hard time when you're really, getting in the trenches with the patient, you do see very good outcomes. So,
Mm-hmm.
um,
It's also part of it because the VR experience, it also engages your body, so it activates more cognition in that sense. And when you're just talking about an experience, it's and I can tell from like having talking about my own traumas that it's different when I just talk about it than rather experience the feeling, the tension, maybe the sweat that I have when I'm actually exposed in that situation and I feel like vividly the trauma than rather like talking like, yeah, in that moment I was anxious and then this happens. It's also almost like you can retrace into a coping mechanism, like intellectualizing everything, just rather experiencing it. How I realize it by myself is like that I don't speak about me being the person, rather just describe what happened from an outside perspective, like disengaging with the body. And so that's why I'm asking myself, is also the VR experience something that help engaging the body as well as like the whole, let's say, cognitive experience in that sense?
I think you hit the nail on the head here. That, you know, thinking about your trauma in the abstract,
Mm-hmm.
okay, maybe that can get you close to it and you can begin to process it. But having a full body experience that, of course, is manageable, but is activating. We talk about this when we work with children that have special needs about embodied cognition. And I think it's a more sophisticated to look at the human experience, not to have that mind-body duality, but look at it as one unified element. And in fact, we try to touch on it as much as possible with the PTSD work. For example, we run our sound through subwoofers in a bass shaker platform so that when somebody is driving in a vehicle down a desert road, the sound of that vehicle comes up through their body through these
Mm-hmm.
subwoofers in the platform. And so you get that vibratory feeling. Or if there's an explosion, you feel it go rumbling through the bass shaker and you feel it through your body. But that gets you a little bit. But we have colleagues in Norway that have implemented um, an omnidirectional treadmill with BraveMind. And the idea there is that when you're wearing a headset, rather than using a game controller
Mm-hmm.
or a hand controller of some type to navigate and turn, and you still turn your body and so on, but to move forward,
Mm-hmm.
You're using a controller, basically a joystick.
Yeah.
Um, but they use an omnidirectional treadmill. So you're actually walking on this treadmill and you can turn and walk different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And they haven't published any data, but they've got promising results from the preliminary data showing that that might really add some value. And in fact, other researchers now in the Netherlands and the United States have begun to implement a treadmill. They call it 3MDR. Mike Roy at the uh, Walter Reed Army Hospital in Washington has implemented this, along with Eric Vermetten from the Netherlands. And they've published a number of studies showing that by walking on a treadmill while you're doing your exposure, and sometimes that exposure doesn't necessarily need to be fully immersive. Um, I think it's better immersed. I think containing the
Mm-hmm.
environment is useful, but they've experimented with delivering it on a flat screen in front of the user and using some of the user generated content so that the veteran could bring in photographs from their
Mm-hmm.
deployment and have those things pop up, gradually fading in and out. And they're almost creating their own exposure from content they have or from generic wartime content and sound effects and so on. So I think, the idea of VR isn't just limited to just one strategy, like, oh, if you're going to use VR for PTSD, it's got to be
Mm-hmm.
prolonged exposure. Well, there's these other elements of therapy, and it is a vibrant field of researchers. That the cool thing about working in the field of VR is that we're not like super proprietary. Um, I could swear right now to describe the kind of person I'm thinking of, but I won't. But people that are real pain in the butts. That are always worried about being the first at something or our way is the best way,
Yeah.
real dogmatic. You know, all of us are cheering for each other that hopefully one of us has got to come up with the idea that's really going to make a difference, or a combination of our ideas are going to make a difference. So that's one of the very cool things about working in VR.
Mm-hmm.
There's a certain type of person that's drawn to this field that is usually more open and you know
Yeah.
com, collegial camaraderie, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. Sounds like a nice field to be in. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it before already about the virtual classroom, and you did a study and research paper about attention and children with ADHD, also traumatic brain injury and autism. So, what did the research reveal? So, what was the outcome?
Well, the virtual classroom initially is it's just a simulation of a classroom environment that you can put a child in a headset. This is one of those
Mm-hmm.
apps that I think really demands full immersion. And so now you're putting a child in something that represents a challenging environment for them to maintain their attention.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you can systematically present stimuli on the board up front, a continuous performance task. The child has to attend to letters that pop up on the board. And when they see perhaps an A followed by an X, they have to hit the button. And so that's the cognitive test, the continuous performance test. But in the background, we can systematically present distractions that are natural to a classroom, whether it's a school bus going by a window outside, or kids fidgeting, or passing notes, or a teacher going to answer the door, an intercom, or a kid in the back throws a paper airplane, whatever, whatever crazy stuff happens in a classroom, we can mimic that. So now what you have is a way to test attention, but number one, in an ecologically relevant environment, of an environment of relevance for where you want to see performance improve. a classroom, an important environment for kids. But you can systematically see the impact of distraction. And at the same time, you can do that by measuring, of course, their head movement. So as we know, when you're in a VR headset, all your movement is being tracked so that when you move your head, the graphics update in real time. You get the illusion of immersion being in that world. Well, that's a measurement device. That's measurement we get for free. So I can tell if a child is supposed to be looking straight forward like this, to pay attention to the activity on the board, but then they look like this. Well, I'm getting a measure of that. And so now I can begin to quantify total activity from the headset and from the hand controller that they're using, how much fidgeting generally. But I can also tell, did that child miss a target on the board up front because they were looking away and it was happening outside their field of view? Or were they just dead on sitting there looking and spacing out? Those are two fundamentally different attention errors that you can't get from any other traditional test at this point.
Yeah.
You can only get it in a VR simulation, and you can quantify distractibility versus loss of focus and see gender differences between little boys and little girls at different ages on that. And there's so many factors. Anyway, so that's the rationale for why we would do it in VR, to make it more realistic than a traditional paper and pencil or even a computer delivered test that's, abstract stimuli. And the distractibility component that allows us to get a clearer differentiation between the hyperactivity or the inattentive component of ADHD, of which, the three types are hyperactive, inattentive, or mixed type. So we get very clear measures, and that's part of the power that's the unsung hero of VR, is that everything that goes on in a VR environment, you have a high capability to quantify that behavior, that activity, that performance level, and that's where it makes a difference. So in our work, and by the way, virtual classroom was my first head mount display VR application that I built with our team. That wasn't just me. I was just the psychologist with the idea. I worked with computer programmers and graphic artists and all, so I'm not going to claim credit for all of it. But that was back in 1998. Up to that point, I had worked in 3D holographic visualizations for visual spatial abilities. But this was my first foray into a head-mounted display because it made so much sense. And since that time, we've done tons of studies with it, but the most recent study is with our newly productized version of the classroom. And there are other companies. There was a company in Spain pretty much copied the idea of the original VR classroom, but that's another story for another time. But we have a productized version here in the United States and Central America that makes it so that clinicians can actually purchase the system. And in our research, what we try to do, as would any good neuropsychologist would do, and that is to build a normative database. How do neurotypical children perform in the classroom over a 13-minute test on all of these variables that we're measuring, and use that as a reference standard for comparing performance of kids that you suspect may have ADHD or may have autism or may have suffered a sports concussion injury, and you want to get a quick measure and have very tight standards to compare with. So we collected about 840 neurotypical kids from age 6 to 13. And then, we published our norms for that recently. Right now, we're writing up the paper on comparing 245 ADHD kids with the normative database. So we see very clear differences
Mm-hmm.
on many of the variables. Primarily, we see missed targets, like how many times did a kid just miss a target that went by? Um, we see dramatic differences across the age span on that. We see more head movement, more looking away. We see a little bit less of that with little girls.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the interesting things, is that boys are typically diagnosed 4 or 5 times more times than little girls. But does that mean that little girls don't get ADHD? Is it a genetic thing? And what we find is that a lot of the metrics for inattentiveness show little girls having a very high level of inattentiveness, missing targets, but they're not showing the hyperactivity component to the same
Mm-hmm.
degree. They're not turning their head, they're not fidgeting as much. And so my hypothesis on this is that they're doing something that diverts attention away from them as possibly having an attention issue. They're sitting quietly like a good little student in a classroom, and they're not manifesting the behavior like little boys often do that
Yeah.
draw the attention to them. And consequently, they may miss out, they may fall under the radar and not get the type of treatment or rehabilitative activities that that a little boy might get access to because they're noticed. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that, and this is found with a lot of people that don't get that period during their age 6 to 10 years old period where it can really matter. They're missing out on that, and then they finally get diagnosed as a young adult, and
Yeah.
they've got to come back from all that. Now, I think ADHD sometimes can. I think if treated early on, it can
Mm-hmm.
really become superpower. And even if not treated, because a lot of people from my generation, ADHD was a pipe dream, really. No, tons of us had it, I think, or we never got the kind of focused attention put on it. And
Mm-hmm.
somehow we turned out okay. But still, I think in a world where we want to maximize people's potential,
Mm-hmm.
at least having an awareness of this and developing ways that that cognitive challenge can be addressed in kids, I think is a good thing to be doing. And so developing state-of-the-art methods that
Mm-hmm.
kids don't mind actually doing is a good thing. I mean, kids, when you bring out a headset in a clinical setting, all of a sudden the whole nature of the room changes.
Yeah.
Oh, virtual reality, can I try that? And so you don't have to twist their arm to do an attention test. No, anyway,
Yeah.
I
One thing that just came to me while having our discussion is about I mean we talked a lot about attention, and that attention can be a function, or missing attention can be a function, either ADHD, traumatic brain injury, or autism. But there's
or
another.
anxiety disorders too.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Thank you for adding that as well. But the other thing that I'm just curious about is, now we have, let's say, through the excessive use of social media and smartphones, it's almost like they're mimicking these kind of like neurodivergence, and in a sense that are, they are basically not a sickness in that sense, but they are a condition, a neurological condition. And you can even argue almost that using these, or using the social media and in the combination with smartphones, is something that mimics that you have this neurological problem in that sense. And it's almost like that thought is for me frightening in a sense, because on the one hand you have like somebody that had maybe a traumatic injury, and then you have somebody that just used his brain differently by engaging with these activities, but he has the same outcomes in terms of how he behaves and how his cognitive performance pans out to be, and in particular to of attention. So is my train of thought correct, or what is your take on that?
Rudy, I think you're spot on here. I think that's very insightful, because I think the way you're describing it, it's almost like we're building a world that is designed to train ADHD, to instill it in people, because people are getting, little micro bites of information from one thing to another, and there isn't so much of the reinforcement to stick. Now, I think this is a challenge with social media. And, honestly, I'm an old guy. So when I hear about how kids spend their time online now, it is frightening, because it's going from one, 12 to 20-second clip after another. And where is the time to integrate, to reflect, to make comparisons? A lot of times, people have done studies showing that if you watch just a lot of these little clips, these TikTok clips and so on, the memory for the actual things that you saw fades like that. There isn't as much consolidation, and because it's just little bites. You might remember, you don't remember every bite of a gourmet meal, but you do remember the meal, the next day, and it's good, but that might not be so good for information. But, I don't know, I anguish about what's the solution to that? Are we going to be able to turn the clock back, or can we develop competing activities? And, in some sense, kids that play video games that have a narrative element that go on, that's a little bit different, because that's engaging you in a story. And maybe that is the counterbalance. Maybe, we're not going to get rid of media. So maybe we've got to try to inform media, and parents make the choice in having some level of control over how a child spends screen time and so on, because we know that we can develop really compelling, engaging, long form content. Can we do that in a way that is going to boost someone's sustained attention, their concentration, and their processing? Because, we may make up for what we lose in the quick attention stuff by the fact that we can help people visualize very deep theoretical processes in a VR or any 3D simulation. We can make it easier for somebody to understand atomic interactions or chemical processes, whatever. We can put that in a visualization. We can make some of that stuff more fun by making it game-like, or making it more relevant, teaching the laws of physics by putting you on a space mission in VR, where you've got to solve problems, and in order to advance in the game to get to Mars, you got to solve a science problem, and it's almost like you're not studying science, but you are, in order to you're making it problem-based gaming. So maybe those are some solutions, but I think you're right on. We're building a world that is fostering high levels of distractibility.
So sounds depressing on the one hand, but on the other hand, something that you mentioned, this reminds me of the work of Manu Kapoor, who's a learning researcher. I had him also on the pod, and one of his basic premise was his whole framework is productive failure. And one of the things that he found is that framing a learning challenge in a way that you will fail is far more engaging, first of all, and also it creates more activation of things that you have already learned. And besides of that, also the transfer is far higher, and the concept the understanding of the concept is also deeper. And it goes directly in the way that you described, like having, for instance, a game about physics that will be so much more engaging for the people to engage with the content and also learn it from a deeper perspective. And I think that's probably something that we should use in order to move forward, because on the one hand we have this like amazing technology that is super engaging and highly stimulating and pleasurable to use, but we just use it in a way that it rather destroys our brain function. But maybe there's also an anecdote that we can use it for good. So, and this leads me to my last question, is like, what is, from your perspective, the biggest opportunities VR can give us in the next decade?
Before I answer that, the point you brought up, didn't they do that in Star Trek with the simulation task that Kirk cheated on in order to beat the Kubarachi or whatever it is?
That's true. Yeah. He changed the code, right? Something around those lines.
And it was rationale, it's like, well, it was an unwinnable situation, so I had to make it winnable, and that's how I won, whatever. But back to your point with the I guess what do I think is the future on this, or the big thing to look forward to? I think I would have to say, and I don't want to sound just like everybody jumping on the pack here, but I think the integration of AI in the mix. We didn't get a chance to talk about any of that because there are a number of applications where AI is showing value for creating content, for measuring performance, for updating stimulus presentation in real time, and for building highly interactive conversational agents, virtual humans, that can serve a variety of clinical purposes and maybe some social purposes if managed well. But I think the integration of AI with VR is going to be where a lot of the action is going to be. I think the two technologies are well matched. I went to a talk last week where the person said AI should have been invented first because it would have made the VR work a lot easier. And there's some question about that, but AI has been around conceptually for a long time, but its actual real usable implementation is more recent. But I think that's where we're going to see a lot of the value, whether it's talking to a conversational agent that's credible, or it's updating this, it's monitoring performance second by second, and maybe updating the challenge level to more emulate the flow channel that we talked about, or to quantify behavior and make predictions for what would be the next step in a therapeutic process. I think there's just a lot of power in these areas. Along with that power comes extreme responsibility.
Indeed.
I mean, come on, there are a lot of ways this can go bad. But so you got to keep an open mind on one side, but a cautious enthusiasm, I guess, on the other side. That's what I would pick.
You know what is funny? In both cases, the innovation came from the game industry. I mean, that we can utilize AI is now the results of these GPUs that were developed for rendering graphics, and same VR.
NVIDIA.
You see, so it's interesting how this all ties together. I mean, Skip, it was a pleasure talking to you. I can go on for another hour. Unfortunately, we don't have the time, but I would suggest that we do a follow-up at some point of time, because there's so much more to discuss and you have a wealth of knowledge, and we could not even touch half of it. So
I'd be more than happy to have another conversation with you. It's been very engaging and exciting, and thank you again for inviting me to this.
You're welcome.